Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Stephanie Bree and I'm wrapping up I'm continuing Console Wars. This is episode 6 and we're wrapping up the Bit Wars. This is the end of the Bit Wars. We're going to be talking about Nintendo 64, Sega Dreamcast, Sony PS2, Nintendo GameCube, and Microsoft Xbox. Now, I had contemplated doing the 64-bit era on its own, which would have basically just been the N64. But I decided that I would lump it in with the Dreamcast and the other ones because it isn't a 32-bit console and it isn't a CD-ROM console, so it didn't fit in any of the videos I've done up to this point. So, if you're new to the channel or familiar, you may know I've already done a fairly popular Nintendo 64 video where I kind of bring to light some of my criticisms of the Nintendo 64. Now, those are all valid criticisms, and that is how I feel about it by and large. I still owned one back in the day, and I still have nostalgia for it, and I can talk about it. I can talk about the good things about it, but we can all agree that it's not perfect. So the Nintendo 64 was the first true 64-bit game console. So we're not counting the Jaguar because it's iffy. You got to do a lot of weird math and complicated science and marketing mumbo jumbo to make it 64-bit. So let's just toss that piece of shit aside. The Nintendo 64 came out 2 years after the PlayStation and Saturn in Japan, and 1 year after the PlayStation and Saturn in the US. The Nintendo 64 was, on the surface, technologically more powerful than the PSX and the Saturn. On the surface. Now, we're not going to get into the tech specs and theoretical limits and all that bullshit. We're just going to talk about strengths, weaknesses, and, impact it had on the market and things of that nature. The N64 had some solid strengths out the box. First, it was a graphical powerhouse, and that's not an understatement. Or actually, that is an understatement. That's a bold statement, but it's actually very true. It was very powerful compared to the other systems on the market at the time. Super Mario 64 definitely showed this off, but later in the console's life, with games like, Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time, Donkey Kong Country 64, Donkey Kong 64, Star Fox 64, Jet Force Gemini, Perfect Dark, Conker's Bad Fur Day. There were so many games, Star Wars, I believe it was Rogue Squadron. Just so many fantastic, damn good-looking games on the N64. I would argue the N64 is the line. We draw a line down the middle. If you're on the left side of the Nintendo 64, as in you came out before the Nintendo 64, you're in the retro vintage era of gaming. If you're on the right side of the Nintendo 64, as in you came out after it, you are on the modern side of gaming. The market changed. The gaming philosophy changed. 2D, side-scrolling, platformers, beat-em-ups, 2D fighters, action, puzzle, shooters, etc. The games that came before were done. They were still getting them on PlayStation and Saturn, but with the N64, it was 100% 3D all the way. Yeah, there were a handful of pseudo 3D and 2.5D games, but they were still 3D games at their core. The N64 was well known for its rare platformers by the company Rareware and its multiplayer games. I've already talked about that. That is the console strength. If you have 4 controllers and 4 friends to play with, and you got a copy of GoldenEye or Mario Kart 64 or Mario Party or Bomberman 64 or any number of games, you're going to have a goddamn good time. I'll admit that. That's perfectly fucking true. The N64 opened the vehicle. Excuse me, opened the door. Why did I say vehicle? We'll talk about vehicles, driving games. It opened the door for multiplayer gaming, which would eventually shift into online gaming down the road. But online gaming had been experimented with off and on in roundabout ways here and there. But, the N64 was not technically online, not in the US anyways. But it was getting us ready for it with its 4-player split-screen multiplayer. Now, the Nintendo 64 also started to get console gamers used to another new type of game which would dominate in the subsequent generation, which would be after the end of the Bit Wars, which is why I'm talking about these. And that is the console first-person shooter. Now, PC gamers had already had some time to get used to first-person shooters. They already had Wolfenstein 3D, they already had Doom, Quake, Heretic, Duke Nukem 3D, and a host of others. But the N64 brought the 3D first-person shooter to the home console. No longer were we stuck with low-resolution, low-quality audio, half the maps missing piece of crap ports on the Super Nintendo and 32X, etc., etc. Now we were getting good 3D first-person shooters. You're getting Doom 64, Quake 64. You're getting the South Park first-person shooter, GoldenEye 007, and the Turok games, and a few others. So now console gamers have a taste of the multiplayer first-person shooter arena that PC gamers had been getting used to up to this point. So things were about to clash in the next generation. So the N64 does kind of exist in a vacuum. While it was supposedly competing either directly or indirectly with the 3DO, the Saturn, the Neo Geo CD, the PlayStation, and later in its life, the Dreamcast. Because remember, the N64 went all the way till 2001, so did the Dreamcast. So they were in either direct or indirect competition. But the N64 stands alone because it is the lone cartridge 3D console on the market. Now, the 32X was a cartridge-based system, but it's technically an add-on for the Genesis. It doesn't stand alone. So the N64 is a standalone cartridge 64-bit system. Now, a disk drive was released in Japan and planned for the US at one point in time, allegedly, but it never happened. This would have been their answer to a CD-ROM attachment, which at that point they probably would have just been better off giving it a CD-ROM attachment or making it CD-ROM to begin with, but because they didn't, we have to deal with that. Now, in my previous criticism in the N64, I was really harsh on its single-player offerings. Now, I want to backtrack a little bit on that, and I want to clarify some things. I know a lot of Nintendo 64 gamers did have single individuals did have a lot of single-player games to play on the N64. You had your racing games, you had your sports games were single-player but also multiplayer. You had, Mario 64, Donkey Kong 64, Banjo-Kazooie, Banjo-Tooie. You had Glover, which is a good game. I had it. It was fun. Mischief Makers, I believe. You had Conker's Bad Fur Day, and quite a few others. However, the reason why I personally was harsh on the 64 back in the day and even still today as a single player gamer is because I did own also a Sony PlayStation, which was by and large way, way, way better for single player, deep, rich, large worlds, story based games. You had a handful. You had Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, and maybe one or two other big 3D, single player worlds to explore on the N64, but not a lot. Not like you had on the PlayStation. It's just true. Not like you had on the PlayStation. You had a lot of collectathons. Now, I know Nintendo gamers, and I know especially 3D platformer fans like the collectathons. I did not. I did like Jet Force Gemini, to be fair. I did like Ocarina of Time, to be fair. I did like Perfect Dark, Turok, Star Wars. So there were single player games to play, just not on the same level as PlayStation. So that was taken into consideration at the time and should be to this day in its in evaluation of it. The N64 was also notable in that it definitely pushed 3D polygonal gaming way harder than the Saturn or the PSX, because the PSX was not really... It was built with 3D gaming in mind, but it was built on outdated tech by the time the N64 came out. And when the N64 came out, it was top of the line, state of the art, cutting edge tech when it came out. So the N64 did have that as an advantage as well. And I know you're going to talk about load times, cartridges versus CDs. I get it. I don't think it was an issue because I was just too busy playing my PlayStation games. I didn't fucking notice the load times, but whatever. It's a thing people are going to mention. Get down. Get down, get down, get down. Stupid cat. But, you know what? It really wasn't an issue on the 64. So that is a fair point in the Pro N64 column. It's not a great point. I mean, it's moot, more or less, but it is a point in that column. Now, I didn't talk much about the sports games or the wrestling games on the N64, and that was on purpose. And that's because the sports games on the Nintendo 64 and also the racing games, which I talked about, were pretty impressive graphically. But again, not all, but a good chunk of them were also available on Saturn and PlayStation. And so they weren't really exclusive to the Nintendo 64. You didn't have to own an N64 to play Madden or NFL Blitz. It may have, debatable, been the better experience than playing Madden on the PlayStation. Certainly better than the Saturn, because it had one fucking Madden game and it was the worst one. But still, you could get your Madden fix elsewhere. So, like all Nintendo consoles, you're really, if you're going to be honest with yourself, you're there for the first party stuff. And let's be honest, there were not very many Nintendo first party games on the Nintendo 64. A lot of the games Nintendo gets credit for on the N64, games they published but didn't develop, were not made by Nintendo. A lot of them were made by Intelligent Systems. Some of them were made by Rareware, as I've already mentioned. Some of them were made by Hudson Soft. Some of them were made by Midway, like the Cruisin' Games and Killer Instinct, which Killer Instinct was a joint venture between Midway and Rare, so it's like debatable who gets credit for what. And then there were other developers. The point is, for the most part, the games people remember playing on the N64 that they associate with Nintendo weren't made by Nintendo. So the Nintendo games were Mario 64, Mario Kart 64, Star Fox 64, and the two Legend of Zeldas. I'm not saying that's it, but as far as I'm concerned, that's it, because the Kirby game sucked, the Yoshi game sucked, and I can't think of anything else that they made, you know, because other companies made the sports games, other companies made the Mario Party, other companies made Smash Brothers. Nintendo may have, I don't remember. Nintendo may have done Paper Mario, but I don't think so. I think that was Intelligent Systems, if I'm not mistaken. But it could have been Nintendo EAD, so don't quote me on it. But either way, I did like Paper Mario. Don't get me wrong. It was cute. It was fun. But it was, like, too soon. And what I mean by that is we were taking the leap from 2D to 3D. We really didn't need a 2D flat sprite based type looking 2.5D game on the N64. You know, maybe we did maybe we should have, I guess, to make the transition easier. Maybe we should have played Kirby Crystal Shards or Yoshi Story. Maybe, I don't know. But I didn't, and I don't think most people did either. Now, yeah, Paper Mario was fun, but I feel like it was too soon to jump back into 2D on the system that was marketed as 3D. That's just me, though. Now, at the tail end of the Nintendo 64's life, it got a new challenger, the Sega Dreamcast, which would be Sega's swan song. Now, the Dreamcast, we're going to shift focus now. The Dreamcast is only slightly more powerful than the N64 on paper. And what I mean by that is the maximum number of polygons per second that the N64 can push is 1 million per second. The Dreamcast can do between 3 to 6 million depending on variables. So it is more powerful than the N64 out the gate, 3 to 6 million polygons per second. And a faster system bus, more RAM, etc., etc. You know, it was a good entry point in the next generation. The Dreamcast continued the N64's legacy with 4 controller ports, and also, it had a weird controller that was kind of reminiscent of the Saturn 3D controller, but also kind of reminiscent of the N64 controller in a roundabout way if you squint, but you do have to squint pretty hard. But almost, I said, in a roundabout way. I mean, if you squint. But it was definitely its own thing. Now, the Dreamcast had the distinction of getting a lot of games that were ports of games on the N64 and the Sony PlayStation, because those were the two most successful consoles at the time. So, the Dreamcast's early library didn't do enough to distinguish it from the existing consoles. It did look better than the PlayStation, and it did look better on the surface than the N64, but there were a lot of early Dreamcast games that they could have been on the N64, on the 64 DD, or if it had used CD-ROMs. Yeah, I could conceivably see them being on the N64. So the Dreamcast didn't have that mind-blowing, wow, this is next gen right out the gate. It did eventually get there, don't get me wrong. It did. Sonic Adventure, Shenmue, I'm running out of steam. I'm sorry. There wasn't a lot on the Dreamcast. Soul Calibur was the one I was trying to think of a second ago. Virtual On, I believe, was on the Dreamcast. And putting all that aside, the Dreamcast did something nobody had done before. it came out of the box internet enabled. Now, out of the box meant dial-up internet, but you could get a LAN internet network adapter, but it had internet capability from day one, and it had a subscription service to let you play video games online. So you had Phantasy Star Online and some others. And I will say, I remember at the time, I was not mind-blowing impressed with the Dreamcast. I remember I'd been playing a lot of N64 and a lot of PlayStation 1, and I was seeing a lot of those games on the Dreamcast. Yeah, they maybe had smoother graphics. Yeah, they maybe had, better, higher resolution textures or higher resolution pre-rendered backgrounds. They were better, but they were noticeably better, absolutely, but not mind-blowing. Like the N64, the first time I saw Mario 64, my mind was blown. The first time I saw Sonic Adventure, I was like, oh, okay, it's Mario 64 on a CD-ROM system. It's what Mario 64 could have looked like. So I wasn't like, ooh, mesmerized with the Dreamcast. Others may have been, and if you were, that's fine. I just wasn't. Now, I was mind blown when I saw the GameCube, when I saw Luigi's Mansion, and I was mind blown when I saw Dragon Ball Z Budokai on the PlayStation 2, and I was mind blown when I saw Halo on the Xbox. That was next gen to me. Dreamcast felt like a half step. Yeah, it's more powerful than the PSX and the N64, but not as powerful as the PS2, Xbox, GameCube. So, while it was technically the start of the next generation from that standpoint, it was also, along with the N64, the end of the bit wars. It was the first home console released in the 90s where its bits were not a part of the marketing. And this caused a lot of confusion. Some people thought it was a 64-bit system. Some people thought it was a 128-bit system. Doesn't exist. There's no such thing as a 128-bit system, but people thought that. And because of that, they also thought PS2, GameCube, Xbox were 128-bit systems. Here's why the bit wars ended. You ready to have your mind blown? The Sega Dreamcast and the Microsoft Xbox are 32-bit consoles. The Sony PS2 and the Nintendo GameCube are 64-bit consoles. And they go from least powerful to most powerful: Dreamcast, PS2, GameCube, Xbox. 32-bit, 64-bit, 64-bit, 32-bit. How is that possible? Because bits don't mean shit. You were lied to when they told you bits matter. They don't fucking matter. It's just math. It's literally how many instructions per second can the CPU render, and can it process 16-bit code or 32-bit code or 64-bit code. And spoilers, even though the Nintendo 64 had a 64-bit processor, a lot of games were written using 32-bit code because they were written for the PlayStation and ported to the N64, made for one 32-bit system, and using that same 32-bit code, just running on a 64-bit processor using the 32-bit mode, which was possible and is what a lot of people did. Now, I have a fondness for the Dreamcast because I'm a Sega fan and it was their last console. And I have a fondness, contrary to popular belief, for the N64 because it was a very impressive system at the time. I don't have that nostalgia for the PS2 because I didn't buy a PS2. I got a GameCube. I briefly considered getting an Xbox until I saw Luigi's Mansion, and I was like, no, I'm going to stick with Nintendo this time. So I went from SNES to N64 to GameCube. So I would follow the Nintendo path for a while, but we're just talking about the systems now. Now, to be fair, when the PlayStation 2 launched, it also didn't really look all that next gen for the most part up front. You had a lot of Dreamcast ports or games that were ported from the Dreamcast, and you had a lot of PlayStation 1 games that were looked like they could have been PS1 games with just some higher res textures and some lighting effects and things that the PS1 couldn't do. There were a lot of early PS2 games that didn't really blow our minds. The first big PS2 release that blew everybody's mind was Grand Theft Auto 3. That's undeniable. That, at that moment, when that game released, is when the next gen truly began. And boy, howdy. The PS2, the Dreamcast, the Xbox, and the GameCube all had internet connectivity. However, the Dreamcast came with it built in, the Xbox came with it built in, the PS2 you had to buy it separately, and the GameCube you had to buy it separately. Now, just by numbers alone, PlayStation 2 sold really well out the gate, and it sold enough network adapters out the gate, and because it was not technically as powerful as the Xbox, it had parity with the Xbox. It was like the Super Nintendo and the Genesis. One is better at this, the other one's better at that. That's how it was with the PS2 and the Xbox. Yeah, the PS2 was better at some things, the Xbox was better at other things, but there was pretty much parity. Same with the GameCube. Pretty much. So the PS2 did get a lot of online enabled games as well because they were coming from the Xbox. They were being made for the Xbox or the Dreamcast and getting ported to the PS2 because the Xbox was the new game on the block and the Dreamcast was Sega's swan song. They were throwing in the towel. So you had a lot of games that started on the Dreamcast, Sonic Adventure, Shenmue, etc. I don't know them all, that got ported over to the new systems. Some of them fell on the PS2, some of them fell on the Xbox, some of them fell on the GameCube. And Sega shifted their focus to third-party developer. They started spreading their franchises out accordingly. The games they thought Xbox gamers would like, they got. The games they thought Nintendo gamers would like, they got. The games they thought PlayStation gamers would like, they got. And so on and so forth. For whatever reason, Sega wasn't going to say, let's make a game and put it on all three systems. For whatever reason, they didn't do that. They probably should have. And let's be honest, some of those PS2 era Sega games probably shouldn't have got made, if you want to really be honest. If you really want to be honest. But we're not here to talk about Sega. We're here to talk about the generation as a whole. The console wars. That's the whole point. So, the Dreamcast had what was known as a GD-ROM. It's essentially... Excuse me. I'm not a computer scientist. But from what I understand, it's essentially a CD-ROM with the error correction removed. Kind of like how the video CD doesn't have error correction, so you can fit more video on a video CD than you can audio on an audio CD. That kind of situation. But it was kind of, I guess, proprietary to Dreamcast. The PS2 used a DVD-ROM, but a lot of the early PS2 games, like the first year, were on CD-ROM. And then you started getting games on DVD-ROM, and then the problem came about midway through the life cycle when they started putting games on dual-layer discs. The PS2 sometimes didn't handle the layer ship, switch from one layer to the next. For some games, this was wonky, but it wasn't a major issue, but it was an issue for some people. The other strength of the PlayStation 2, besides being almost 2.5 times more powerful than the Dreamcast, just doing the math, about 2.5 times more powerful than the Dreamcast, and having a DVD-ROM and internet connectivity, which the Dreamcast had, comparable. It had 1 GB disc, so the Dreamcast or this PS2 had 4.7 to 8.5 GB disc, depending on if it was dual layer or single layer. But the PlayStation 2 had another advantage that maybe if Sega had the foresight, they could have included in the Dreamcast, but they didn't. And that's backwards compatibility with the previous gen. Now, from a marketing standpoint, it didn't make sense for Sega to say, here's our next gen Dreamcast, please forget about the Saturn, but oh, by the way, it also plays Saturn games just in case. Wouldn't have been a very good marketing move, and it probably wouldn't have helped either way. It probably just would have hurt the sales more than helped the sales, most likely. But the PlayStation was still going strong in 2000 when the PS2 launched. So being fully back, well, mostly, not fully 100%, but 97.5-ish% compatible with the PS1 was a big deal. Also, the PlayStation came with a new and improved DualShock controller, which had been introduced on the PlayStation a couple years prior, which was an improvement over the original PlayStation pad and their answer to the Nintendo 64 analog stick. And the Sega Saturn 3D controller, they probably didn't even notice it. They probably don't even know it exists to this day. They've never heard it. You've never seen one. Don't lie. All right, maybe you have, but I don't believe you. I had one at one point, but I'm a Sega nerd. I collected Sega stuff. I went out of my way to buy that shit. Well, that's neither here nor there. So you had this it was ease of transition. You had a family of 4. They had a PlayStation. They got about 15, 20 games. Why would I buy a PS2? Well, while you're waiting for the next gen games to come out, you can keep playing your PlayStation games on your PS2 system. That's a smooth transition. But it had another ace up its sleeve that doesn't get talked about as much as it should, nor as much as it did back in the day. Because back in the day, it was a big fucking deal. And then later on, because of what happened in subsequent generations, people retconned what happened and said, nah, it wasn't as big of a deal as it was. No, it was. The DVD player. The fact that the PS2 was a relatively inexpensive DVD player in the year 2000 was a big deal. Before the PlayStation 2 came out, DVD players were like $300, $400, $500, $600 and up. Especially if you wanted one with progressive scan capabilities, which the PS2 has. So, at $300, this is what you get. At $300, $299 retail at launch, you get a complete working PlayStation 1 plus a complete working next-gen PS2 game console with internet capabilities if you want it. On top of that, a complete working high-end DVD player. So that was a big fucking deal in 2000. These things were flying off the shelves. There were shortages. There were movies made about pirates trying to steal PlayStation 2s. That's what the fucking Fast and Furious was about. The whole movie was about them trying to steal PS2s. So yeah, PS2 was a big fucking deal. If you want proof, just look at the fact that it sold over 155 million units over its 13-year lifespan. No other home console to date has done that. Sold that many units and lasted 13 years. The Switch might come close in units sold, but I don't think the Switch is going to last for 13 years on the market. And the PS4 definitely ain't. The PS4 is already showing its age at 10 years. So this might be the last year for the PS4, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. No, the PS2 was a fucking powerhouse behemoth in terms of sales. And everybody I knew had one, except me. I had a GameCube. But I was happy with the GameCube, don't get me wrong. I was. The whole time. The GameCube is still, to this day, my favorite game console. So I'm not saying this ironically. I literally was truly happy with the GameCube. But Nintendo, something happened between 64 and GameCube. A lot of Nintendo fans don't like to talk about this, but I remember reading about it in magazines, and you can look up the articles if you want. Nintendo was not in a good financial position between 1997 and 2004. They weren't. The Game Boy Pocket, Game Boy Light, Game Boy Color trio of handhelds were not meeting sales expectations. The Nintendo 64 was not meeting sales expectations. This was why the colored consoles came out in the first place, the multicolor consoles, because it was a way to get someone who already owned a Nintendo 64 to trade it into the used video game store and buy the pink one or the green one or the purple one or whatever one matched their personality, and then buy 4 controllers to match. That's what Nintendo wanted you to do. Now, not everybody did that, but when you look at the drop-off from 62 million NES, 45 million Super NES, and barely 29 million N64, that's a big fucking drop. So yeah, it did not meet sales expectations. The software was expensive because the cartridges were expensive to manufacture. So the general rule of thumb is you sell the hardware at a mild loss and make up for it on the software. But if you look at Nintendo N64 software sales, they weren't making up for it. They were struggling. They were hurting. They did have a few million plus sellers, but not as many as they were used to at this point. And the Game Boy Color wasn't getting million plus sellers at all. You know how I know this? Well, not just because we have sales numbers, but also because they go for outrageous fucking prices on eBay because they didn't sell big. But the PS2, GameCube, Xbox, those 3 consoles sold, the PS2 astronomically. The other 2 consoles sold well enough, but the GameCube itself was also not profitable for Nintendo. The GBA was. Nintendo was, as a company, profitable, but they were struggling, and they talked about this constantly in, they were always talking about how they needed to turn things around, right the ship. This is why at the end of the GameCube's life, they went after the Blue Ocean, because the GameCube was also kind of a dud, a sales dud. 24 million units sold. Not a good number. Not a good number. The best-selling game on the system only sold like 7 million units, which isn't bad, but the second best-selling game only sold 3.5 million units, and it just drops off from there. So, yeah, not good. Not great. They were not making their money back on software sales. Third-party companies were not making their money on software sales, so they were abandoning Nintendo left and right. And Nintendo, instead of going cartridges, went with mini discs. Now, okay, it is technically a DVD-ROM, but it's a 1.5 gigabyte DVD-ROM. And again, on the surface, this didn't make a big deal at first, because a lot of the games coming out on the PlayStation in the first year or so were on CD-ROM anyways. They didn't need the DVD-ROM space. But as time went on, third-party companies had to cut features to make their games fit on those mini discs. And this was not going to sit well with gamers who weren't going to pay full price for half the game. And then there's the whole online snafu. The GameCube, for as much as I love it, the fact that they didn't make it easy, for one, to get the network adapter, and 2, they themselves didn't really support it. There were a handful of like 5 games total in the US, I believe, that supported the network adapter, and only 1 or 2 that were actually online. The other 3 or 4 were just local area network play, which is fine, I guess, if you've got 4 GameCubes and what is that, 24 friends or something, I don't know the math, 16 friends, something like that, and 4 network adapters. Yeah, sure. But if not, Well, that's not going to do you any good. You know? It's not. Not going to do you any damn good. So that meant games that had online features on PS2 and Xbox, and also PC, had those features removed as well because there was no reason to have them in the game. So again, you're paying full price for half the game. That was a hard sell. I did buy a lot of games on the GameCube. Just personal experiences, anecdotal. I bought about 60 games or more for the GameCube during the time I had it. For comparison's sake, I never had more than like 12 or 13 games on the N64. And I had probably 70 or 80 games on the PS1. So that kind of gives you... Even though I was more of a Nintendo gamer and I liked the Nintendo better, I was just finding more games on the PlayStation because they were cheaper and easier to find. And there just were more of them. Same thing happened here. The GameCube did have kind of solid third-party support up front, and then it slowly started to fall off a cliff. Now, Nintendo did go out of their way to try to salvage that third-party support with some efforts to like let third-party companies do things with Nintendo characters and franchises and special exclusive GameCube content and things like that. There was the whole Capcom 5 debacle, where Capcom was allegedly going to commit to make 5 exclusive games for the GameCube. We got one game out of the deal that was exclusive. We got Resident Evil 4, which was a timed exclusive, and then the other games never materialized. They just never happened. So Nintendo fans were kind of jaded in the GameCube era, myself included. But they did have something going for them, for some of us, myself included, that Sony and Microsoft didn't have. Microsoft, they were seen as like, what the fuck are they doing making a game console? Leave me alone. Get out of here. I don't want to talk to you. PlayStation, while it wasn't accurate to say this, Nintendo gamers thought, and PlayStation gamers did as well because they bragged about it, thought that, and so did Sega gamers who migrated to the next gen. The point is, there was a significant number of gamers at the time who truly believed Sony killed Sega. And so, for whatever reason, a lot of people became anti-Sony as a result. Some of them flocked to Xbox, some of them flocked to PC, and some of them flocked to Nintendo. It just wasn't enough of us to match the massive number of people that were flocking to PS2. It was like Dreamcast, GameCube, Xbox combined sales were about still less than half of the PS2 sales. So yeah, the PS2 was a fucking behemoth. Now, the Xbox is the elephant in the room. We haven't talked about it yet. The Xbox, on the surface, is a lot like the Dreamcast. 32-bit processor, DVD-ROM instead of CD-ROM, internet connection out of the gate. A lot of Sega games came out on it right up front. A lot of the same kind of games. A very similar controller. It just kind of felt like this was where Sega was supposed to go. Where Sega wanted you to go. Where Sega fans were meant to go. It just didn't happen that gen. That's okay. Now, the Xbox, unfortunately, was only successful in Europe and North America. It didn't even hardly exist at all in Japan, which meant Japanese developers and publishers didn't even pay it the time of day. So you didn't get big hits like Final Fantasy and, whatever Capcom was fucking doing. Resident Evil 4 or, I don't know, Tomb Raider. What was Tomb Raider Japanese? I don't know. Eidos, I believe, is who made Tomb Raider at the time. I think they were European, if I'm not mistaken. And also, there were a lot of Western developers not making games for Xbox either. Grand Theft Auto 3 wasn't on the Xbox. So it's not fair to say just because Japan didn't make games for it, it couldn't fly off the shelves. That was an issue. But the Xbox was built to be a PC bridge. It was a PC for the living room. A PC gamer's console for the living room is what it was. If you like PC games, first-person shooters, first-person hack and slash RPGs, racing games, stuff like that, you were in hog heaven on the Xbox. If you didn't, if you're a fan of JRPGs, SOL. Sorry for you. If you're a fan of 2D or 3D fighters, well, we got like this one and that one, but that's it. We're not giving you anything else. Suck it. And 2D platformers, oh god, I don't even want to talk about it. No, the Xbox wasn't the everybody console that they wanted it to be. Not the first time around, anyways. The GameCube, going back to that for a second, did ultimately outsell the Xbox at the end of its life because Xbox was discontinued in 2005 and GameCube was discontinued in 2006, giving Nintendo one more year of sales to try to squeak out a few more GameCubes. And the GameCube was $100 plus less expensive than the Xbox at the time. The Xbox had strong sales out the gate, and then people started saying, you know what, I think PS2 is where it's at. Now, when you would walk into Walmart or Kmart, because they still existed back then, Target or wherever, Best Buy or wherever, your video game aisle, you would have a square about this big with GameCube games and about this big with Xbox games. And you're not going to be able to see this, but way the fuck out here, PS2 games. It was like a whole wall of PS2 games and a little bitty section for GameCube and a little bitty section for Xbox. And then PlayStation 1 games down at the bottom for those losers who still were playing PlayStation 1 at the time. I guess I was one of those losers. So yeah, sure, why not, whatever. So it had the mind presence. You walked into a store and you just knew fucking PS2 had the games because it was in your face. Name it, it was on PS2. Unless, of course, it was Halo or Fable or something made by Nintendo or one of their partners. Now, let's talk about the exclusives. The PS2 has a lot of exclusives, so we don't have to talk about it too much. Let's talk about some of the heavy hitters. Not just exclusives, but some of the games that people remember fondly the PS2 for. Games like Dragon Ball Z Budokai was a big one. That first Madden NFL on the PS2 was a good Madden. I think Madden 2002 was a good one because that was the one that was also on the GameCube. You also had Need for Speed Underground was a good one. Final Fantasy X, Final Fantasy X2. You had whatever Tomb Raider game was on the system. And like I mentioned at the start, way back when, you had Grand Theft Auto 3, and then you had Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, and then you had Grand Theft Auto Vice City. And I don't know which order those games came out in, but those were the games you had. Then you had weird stuff like Okami, which was awesome, Katamari Damacy, which was awesome, Destroy All Humans, which was awesome. And like I said, these aren't all exclusives, but I'm just talking about the games that define the generation. Incredible Hulk Ultimate Destruction was fucking awesome. Marvel Nemesis was awesome. Marvel Legends? Not Legends. Marvel... What the hell was that game called? Was it Legends? No, it wasn't. X-Men Legends. That's the game I was thinking of. It was Marvel something. Marvel... Unlimited? No, it wasn't Unlimited. I don't remember. Whatever. There was a Marvel game that was real popular at the time. I just don't remember what it was called. And come on, this was 24 years ago, for God's sake. I gotta move the thing. And this video is getting long, but it had to, because this was one of the longest generations in history. It really was. The PS2 started in the fall of 2000, and it went all the way until winter of 2013. That's 13 years. So this console generation, if you're going to say it started in 1998 with the Dreamcast, yeah, it's a long-ass time. A lot to talk about. So, to summarize some of it, the PS2 and the Xbox could both play DVDs, but the GameCube couldn't, which was a hindrance to the GameCube a little bit, but not a big deal to Nintendo gamers. We didn't care. I had a DVD player. I actually got my DVD player before I got my GameCube, so I was good by the time I got my GameCube. I was good. So not everybody needed the DVD player. I still had my PS1, so I wasn't dying to rush out and get a PS2 anyways. Also, I didn't mention God of War. That was a game I should have brought up. But also big that generation, just backtracking for a second, were the Prince of Persia games. Those were big. Those were what eventually would lead to the Assassin's Creed formula, gameplay-wise. So those were pretty big. And there was also Devil May Cry was a big one back in the day. Those were pretty fucking big. And then all the regular franchises that were popular on PlayStation 1, they got updates on the PS2. Now, Nintendo did something different, as they often do. Because the GameCube was small and compact and had a handle, and Nintendo knew that you were likely probably also going to have a GBA or a GBA SP in your house, or 2 or 3, they came out with this connectivity mumbo jumbo. I'm not going to get into connectivity. I've already talked about it elsewhere, and it's fucking complicated and messy and whatever. It was expensive, and there weren't a lot of games that supported it that were like really worthwhile. There were 2 games that supported it that were really good. Zelda 4 Swords Adventures and Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles. So when you look at the GameCube, you're not really... Yeah, you bought third-party games if they were available, if it was something that interested you, if the GameCube was your primary console. But you were there for the first-party stuff, and holy shit did Nintendo bring their A game on the GameCube. You know, Sonic... not Sonic. Why did I say Sonic? That's Sega. Mario Sunshine was a pretty good game. Not as good as Mario 64. Nothing has been ever since. Probably nothing ever will be. Nothing is going to blow our minds like that. It's never going to happen. Once your mind is blown, you can't re-blow it. You just can't. So, you had Metroid Prime, which was Nintendo's answer to Halo. Really good game, but not a really good answer to Halo. It didn't have a multiplayer mode to speak of, and it wasn't really a first-person shooter as much as it was a first-person action-adventure game. Still a damn good game. One of my favorite fucking Metroid games of all time. But Nintendo had some controversy with the GameCube elsewhere. Not just the deal with the, half-assed connectivity and the half-assed online connectivity situation. Or the half-assed DVD-ROM that couldn't play DVDs. No, those were issues that did plague Nintendo the entire generation. But they had 2 real solid fuck-ups. Legit, actual fuck-ups that pissed people off. Their first fuck-up is way more obvious and was way more divisive. Nintendo let Microsoft buy Rare out from under them. Rare were the ones churning out the games people were playing on the N64. If they bought an N64, you are probably playing a mix of Nintendo and Rare games. So to lose Rare was a big fuck you middle finger to Nintendo fans. We were flabbergasted. So much so, you can go back and read the reviews and read the comments pre-launch, pre-Rare sale. So much so that everybody who said they liked Star Fox Adventures before the sale flipped and talked about not only how much they hated Star Fox Adventures all of a sudden out of the blue, but also how much they never liked Rare to begin with. They were always a shitty developer. You know, they needed Nintendo to hold their hand, blah, blah, blah. All of a sudden, Nintendo fans were like, yeah, fuck Rare. We don't need them. No, we did. But, you know, whatever. It was what it was. The second major fuck up, and it was a fuck up. I was there. I remember a lot of people were pissed about it. So much so that every year we kept saying, hey, when are you going to fucking fix this? When are you going to fucking fix this? And I love it. You love it. We all bought it. It's fucking Wind Waker. They showed us this gorgeous looking polygonal 3D texture mapped hair flowing in the wind, lighting, shadows, fucking gorgeous tech demo of The Legend of Zelda. And they turned around and gave us a goddamn fucking Hanna-Barbera cartoon instead. Oh, the internet was pissed. Now, it turns out Wind Waker had pretty fucking awesome gameplay and a decent story to boot. So it was like, at the end of the day, a perfectly acceptable game, all things considered. But the damage was done. People were like, no, fuck you, give us a real Zelda. Give us a real Zelda. So much so that real Zelda had to launch on the GameCube's follow-up. Because Nintendo fans were like, God damn it, if it ain't on the system at launch, we're not going to fucking trust you ever again. So, yeah, Nintendo really fucked up there. And they knew it, too. They really did. So, there were other mishaps along the way, but those were the two big fuck-ups. Other mishaps were things like not really doing anything to force Capcom to keep Resident Evil 4 truly exclusive, not doing what they needed to do to keep Sega, who promised Sonic Heroes would be a GameCube exclusive, and oops, now it's a timed exclusive, and now it's multi-plat. They didn't do enough to keep those two games and maybe other possible games that could have been exclusive to the GameCube. They just didn't do enough to keep the games that they told us would be exclusive to our system actually exclusive to our system. Once we saw Resident Evil 4 on the PS2, this finger went right in Satoru Iwata's face at every convention he was present. It wasn't really his fault, but you gotta have a fall guy. And rest in peace, Iwata. We love you. We do. We truly do. You made Nintendo what it was during this era. But we had to flip somebody off. You know what I mean? I'm sorry, but we did. And it was him. Because even though he wasn't directly responsible for it, we had to blame someone, and either he could have done more or he couldn't have done more. We'll never know. But the fact is, here's a handful of rock solid fucking awesome AAA games that we were told were exclusive to our system. And then we're seeing these jackals across the street who made fun of us for buying a GameCube playing our game on their console. Motherfucker. We were pissed. This was when Nintendo fans, by and large, the core Nintendo fans, left Nintendo. What you were left with was, kids and Mario fans or Pokemon fans or Zelda fans. But the people who stuck with them from NES, Super NES, N64, GameCube, we were gone. We were like, fuck you, we're out. We're done. You gotta win us back. Now, for me, this is down the road, they won me back. I bought a Wii. I stood in line and bought mine on launch day. They sold me on the Wii, don't get me wrong. But that's another story for another day. That's the whole next generation. So let's finish this up. Let's get this wrapped up. So, the Xbox failed to meet expectations, but Microsoft did right the ship and turn things around in 2005 with the launch of the Xbox 360, which lit the world on fire, took it by storm, lightning in a bottle, you know the drill. And Nintendo swept the GameCube under the rug and replaced it rather quickly, suddenly almost, with the Wii. And that motherfucker took off. And then Sony made their first fuck up, the PS3. We're gonna get there. That's like the next episode. We're gonna fucking get there. So overall, a lot of gamers, my age and older, and some younger, a lot of us do consider that era, Dreamcast to Xbox, 98 to 2005, as peak gaming. This was when gaming was at its best. A lot of us either jumped ship from one to the other in the next generation, or honestly, a lot of us left altogether. We went to PC, or we fucking got our Angry Birds. We're good. We're done. We don't need any games anymore. That happened to a lot of people my age and older, you know. But the Dreamcast, let's be real, it wasn't up to snuff. It couldn't compete. Even if Sega had the money, it couldn't fucking compete. The PS2 dominated for a host of reasons, too many to count, really. The GameCube struggled for a whole bunch of reasons and a couple of major ass fuck ups. And the Xbox never really got off the ground. It just sort of kept running in place, waiting for the shotgun. And the shotgun never came. I would probably hesitate to call that the greatest generation in gaming. But if you told me it was, I'd nod and say, okay, good for you. I can see it. Because I think the 16-bit era is always going to hold a special place in my heart. And honestly, when it was all said and done, Sega out of the way, 3DO out of the way, Atari out of the way, SNK out of the way, Philips out of the way, etc., etc., etc. When it was all said and done, that generation left us with the big three we have to this day. When the dust settled, we were left with Microsoft, Sony, Nintendo. The days of anybody can make a console and get it out to market and put games on it were fucking over. Well, we've had Microsoft, Sony, Nintendo for 24 years. All right? Let's just look at the 24 years before that. Intellivision, Atari, Coleco, Fairchild Channel F, Sega, Nintendo, SNK, Philips, 3DO, PlayStation, 10, Sony, I guess. TurboGrafx, that's 11. Or Hudson Soft, NEC. That's 11 different console manufacturers in the 24 years that led up to the PS2. 24 different companies dipped their toe in that water. We're left with 3 to this day. The same 3, 24 years later, the same fucking 3. Fighting over the same piece of the goddamn pie. And you know what? It's our fault. We let Sega down. We let Atari down. We let 3DO down. No, it ain't. It's their fault. They fucked up. We just went where the fucking games were. Fuck you. Don't blame me for your failures, Atari. Eat shit. No, the PS2 era, as I'm going to call it, the end of the bit wars, as it were, the start of a new era, the DVD era, which I would have called it this, except for the GameCube didn't play DVDs. No, it was a good fucking solid ass generation. It's just the repercussions of that generation are still being felt to this day. The groundwork that was laid in the online arena is still going to this day. The groundwork that was laid in Nintendo abandoning their efforts to make core games and focusing more on casual and Blue Ocean and franchise games, less experimental stuff, that's still going to this day. Sony more or less playing it safe is still going to this day. Yeah, they tripped up on the PS3, but we'll get there. Looking back on it, maybe it was because I just hit 20 years old when the GameCube came out, so I was in that time of my life, I was just getting into my 20s, I was past my teens, I was over the hump of the hormones. Maybe that's what it is, or maybe that generation really was the last generation with that spark of magic that gave us the awe and wonder we so desperately miss. I don't know. Let me know in the comments. What do you think?